This is a story about John, a cook sergeant, who had only a few days left before the demob, but apparently fate had some other plans for him. The thing is, the world suddenly came to an end, and the guy's unit was completely cut off from the outside world. Commanders were unable to connect to the external network, radios were not receiving a signal either, normal calls and even emergency calls are not working. The unit is safe for now, but the question is for how long, because all military frequencies are paralyzed, and no one knows what will happen next. The only thing that saves this military unit is that it is located high in the mountains. To maximize their safety, the military will try to strengthen the stone fence to serve as a reliable barrier. Also, the problems with food started pretty quickly, supplies were running low, and if the guys wanted to survive, they just had to get out of the unit. Because of the desperation, they had to start doing it. John, for his part, was doing his best in the kitchen. Because in such a difficult time, it's important to do everything you can to lift up the mood of the military, so today's soup is prepared with a special sauce. This secret ingredient will make all warriors fearless and give them a very strong fighting spirit. When it was time for lunch, all the soldiers went to the mess hall to sample another masterpiece that John had prepared. Judging by the satisfied looks on their faces, one could guess that they really enjoyed the meal. Some of them even began to wonder if they could ask for more. Suddenly one of the commanders comes into the canteen, beats his hands hard on the table, and starts saying that it is time to go out and fight, because you cannot be called a soldier and cowardice to sit in the canteen. In response to this, the men rose sharply from the table, and were ready to go to fight for their lives. The commander was insanely pleased that he had a motivated army, and Boris was happy that he had succeeded perfectly in accomplishing his task, raising the spirits of the troops, and increasing their aspirations for a better life. In their free time, the boys did their own things, usually playing basketball or soccer, and when it was time to eat, they all went to the mess hall, but you have to take into account that the danger was not completely gone. Most of the soldiers were still enjoying the food John was preparing, but there were also those who could afford to call the guy's freshly cooked food some of the more unpleasant words. As soon as John noticed a large number of people moving toward the mess hall, he immediately dropped all his work and went straight to the kitchen to cook as much as possible. Because of the strong appetite of the military, never managed to keep up with the standard norms. When suddenly a second chef bursts in and says that tonight for the evening should be fried calamari, but he cannot find them anywhere. Of course, such unpleasant news, he did not like it, to put it mildly, because he specifically asked several times to check the list of products. How the second chef managed to allow such a serious oversight remains a mystery. In response, he said that he checked the products every day, and where they disappeared has no idea. Then the lieutenant personally called the kitchen and said he didn't want roasted vegetables for dinner tonight. That's a real problem, because the place is already short-staffed, and he wants to change the menu. What to do in this situation? No calamari for dinner, he doesn't like vegetables. In that case, John had no better idea than to replace the fried calamari with fried pork brisket, because he remembered that they had leftover brisket that they had cooked earlier. When the guys confirmed that it was available, John promptly asked everyone to start cooking. Also asked him to get cream and chicken out of the fridge, because he knows the lieutenant likes noodles, so it's a good idea to make it with sauce and chicken for lunch. Meanwhile, while the guys were playing soccer, at least one man went missing from their unit. Unfortunately, the monsters had managed to get here and start doing their dirty deeds. This particular specimen looked quite large and formidable. It was still unknown what it was capable of, but judging by the way it stealthily dragged away one of the soldiers, it was hard to call it stupid. When suddenly one of John's coworkers comes up to him and hands him a jar of sweet water, thus hinting to him that it is very soon demobilization, and it would be nice to slowly start celebrating this case. That's certainly true, but John's not leaving yet, so he's not going to celebrate too much. By the way, his colleague envied him with white envy, because he was already dreaming of leaving this place. Then he asked what John's plans were in the civilian life, in response to which he said that it would be nice to take some cooking courses and try to open his own restaurant to be the head chef there. Frankly, the restaurant industry is pretty much no different than the military. John basically agreed with that, but anyway, he's insanely proud of the fact that people say they love his food, so he wants to be better at it. When Mark realized that John's plans were grandiose, he offered him the first time after the demob to work in the very restaurant where he himself worked before he was taken into the army. The reaction to such a proposal was not very positive. To put it mildly, John spit out water and said that he would never agree to such a thing. When the break was over, John reported that they were out of salt and asked Mark to go to the warehouse. About moonlighting at a cool restaurant, it's a pretty good idea, but I don't want to become a subordinate of my current subordinate, so I'm going to have to hold off on the offer. Moreover, Western cuisine is much more attractive to our hero than Japanese cuisine, at least because it is several times more profitable. Suddenly John heard someone shouting from the basement. Since they had just sent Mark there, he immediately realized that it was him who was shouting. In his heart he hoped that nothing serious had happened, but what he saw next shocked him to say the least. Mark was lying on the floor, not moving, with some monster hanging around his body. At first John thought it was just a dream, because he couldn't even begin to understand how a made beast could have gotten into the basement, because it's usually very large and noisy. But when drops of blood started flying all over the basement, he realized that it was definitely not a dream. The first thing that was decided was to try and rescue the younger cooks. John urged them to leave the kitchen as soon as possible and to stay out of the cellar. Then another cook opened the door from the other side of the cellar. He initially asked what the sound was and then just walked in. For some reason, the subordinate failed to see the monster sitting next to him. But unlike the man, the monster immediately noticed him. Immediately, a terrifying roar was heard. The monster's eyes were burning with red lights, and its jaw was filled with teeth as sharp as daggers. The cook was terribly frightened and shouted loudly. When John heard the screams, he rushed to help. He ran at breakneck speed into the basement with knives in hand to try to help his comrade. In the process, he used all his knives against the creature, but it did not help. The coworker was thrown back into the wall from such a hard blow. The monster moved from his seat straight across the table toward the brave John. The man was shocked that his plan didn't work. In a moment, the monster started as if to taunt him and immediately tried to attack. It was incredibly large, strong, and fast. Its claw could definitely do some serious damage. The cook threw himself under the table and John managed to dodge the monster's blow. During the fight, the monster slammed into the wall with all its might, but that didn't stop it, and the staff member continued to panic and asked the sergeant what was going on. It had so much power that they didn't even know how to deal with it. To put it mildly, the guys had no idea how to deal with this creature. They had a lot of questions in their heads, but now they just needed action. Suddenly the cook had an ingenious plan. Nearby was a pot of boiling hot oil. He took it and poured it on the monster, hoping that it would work. In the end it really worked. When the guys saw that the monster was not resistant to boiling water at all, they started pouring as much as possible on the monster. They didn't care how powerful the opponent was, because the hot oil still wouldn't leave him uninjured. Unfortunately, during this operation, when one guy was distracted, the monster accidentally caught him with its tail, and because the blow was too powerful, took his life on the spot. Now John was alone. Despite the fact that the man was already desperate, in the process of fighting, he noticed that the monster constantly began to miss, probably because the boiling water got on his eyes. Now for some time he will definitely not be able to see properly, so it was decided to take the sharpest knife in his hands and begin to act. The guy realized that if he acted loudly it wouldn't work, but time was too short. Grabbing a knife, he threw himself at the monster from behind, and realized that this thing should not leave a single chance. Eventually, after a few precise strokes, everything worked out, and John emerged victorious. Right after the guy eliminated the monster, a new notification appeared right in front of his eyes, informing him that he was able to awaken and from now on he is a level 1 aspiring chief. Now he has such characteristics as strength and magic, and has the opportunity to improve his talents, namely the ability to cook, handle a dagger, and so on. For each success or level up, John will receive special points, which he can exchange for nice bonuses for himself or his comrades. When the guy went outside, he finally realized that the territory was invaded by not just one monster, but many more. This is directly symbolized by a whole bunch of bodies of soldiers lying on the floor right in the middle of the street. It was very hard to believe that they had all lost their lives. Thank at least our hero managed to save himself. By some miracle quietly, he was able to run outside and hide under a thick tree root somewhere in the forest. His moral and physical condition, to put it mildly, leaves much to be desired. But nevertheless, our hero does not give up, and will certainly try to find out what happened. The first thing he wants to know is what kind of monster was in the basement, and what mysterious windows are popping up in front of his eyes. This time, the system alerted him that a world event called the Faction War was about to begin. To take an active part, John needs to create his own faction, or join an existing one. The faction that will show itself best, as a result, will receive special bonuses. Honestly, despite the fact that there are detailed instructions, the guy still didn't understand what it was. Because this program looks like a system window in some game, where it came from and why John got it is a mystery. Then a new notification popped up on the screen informing us that a world event called Capture the Flag was starting right now. In the end, John made a decision for himself that he would close the system for now and not come back to it for a while, because he was too busy to deal with it right now. The first priority was to get out of here, find a safe place, and then think about the system. When John got to his feet, he figured the best thing to do would be to try to find some survivors. But even if he couldn't find anyone, it was important to at least look around, see if he could get something useful, like a weapon better than a kitchen knife. He heard gunshots nearby, so he decided to go straight there. After a few more shots, he realized they were probably coming from the armory. After a few minutes, he was right there. Standing behind the wall, John assumed that it was the military, who decided not to fight the monsters in hand-to-hand combat, but simply took out weapons from the warehouse and opened fire to kill. As they say, hope is the last to go. Let's believe that this is really true. At one moment, the same monster that destroyed Mark in the beginning appears on the other side of the wall, right in front of John. Frankly speaking, it looks even bigger and more intimidating in the middle of a white day, and judging by how aggressive it is, the guy needs to get out of here as soon as possible. In general, the situation is far from the most favorable, because at the moment John has no hot oil to at least try to attack this monster. As suddenly the most important moment, the system sends a new notification, which informs that the guy has discovered a new skill called Eyes of the Chief. In parallel, the system ran some sort of ingredient analysis, and when it was complete, reported that John had received an initial chef's secret, called Lizard Care Enlightenment. Honestly, it's hard to see how it could help in such a complex situation. After a few more seconds, a recipe for how to properly cook this monster to maximize its nutrients came into the guy's head. With the help of this small instruction, he was able to figure out where his opponent's weaknesses were located. To be honest, he didn't want to believe this information, but since he had no choice, he decided to go overboard and try to strike there. To be successful, he had to wait for his opponent to get as close as possible, and to say that it was scary was simply not to say anything. But even though he was very afraid, he gripped the knife tightly, and was ready for just about anything. In the end, as soon as the opportunity arose, John makes a sharp movement to the side, and at the same moment attacks his opponent. Surprisingly, so far everything goes more than well. At the same time, the system sent him a new notification, informing him that the skill of using a weapon in the form of a blade had increased in level. John hadn't thought he'd be able to penetrate the giant's skin with such a small knife, but as it turned out, it wasn't that thick. In the end, after this light touch of the knife, the monster, as if it began to go crazy. This directly symbolizes that if the guy continues to follow the instructions, he will definitely succeed, and he can get out of this fight a happy winner. The main thing is just a little push. The monster finally fell to the ground, and no longer gave any signs of life, and John in turn, because of extreme fatigue, literally on his knees crawled out of it. Honestly speaking, he still could not believe that he had succeeded, because if not for that message, everything could have been very different. As suddenly after the fight, the guy started to feel some strange feeling, as if something was slowly filling him from the inside. To be frank, it was the first time he felt like that. By the way, for the victory John got experience points, an improvement of the skill called the Eye of the Chief. Now he can use absolutely all ingredients. For purposes that will be identified as ingredients in the future, long-term observation of them will eventually reveal the correct recipe or processing method. Now John has finally realized that all of these monsters are treated by the system as edible ingredients, and nothing more than that. According to the description of the lizard, meat is characterized by a light and spicy flavor, but if it is not cooked or overcooked in time, it becomes quite hard, which means that it is already worth paying special attention to it, and well used in some dish, otherwise it just finally spoiled. Then the system wanted to recommend a cooking method, but John asked her to stop recounting all this information. It was not normal to cook anything from such a creature, let alone serve it to people. As soon as he heard that something was going on here, he immediately grabbed his automatic rifle and ran to help, but he managed to come only when everything was over. John didn't think long and introduced himself as a cook from the unit. If it was his man, he would recognize him. As you'd expect, the guys were right behind each other. By the way, this warrior's name is Charlie, and he was madly wondering what John was doing out here by himself, because the street is extremely dangerous, and at any moment you could run into a monster. In response to this guy, he said it's a long story, and he's not ready to discuss it yet. In that case, Charlie strongly recommended moving towards the ammunition depot, because no one can tell exactly when the monsters will reappear. The situation was so critical and unclear that the boys finally insisted on not moving on foot, but running straight away. Upon arrival, John asked his colleagues where all the other chefs were. Unfortunately, the answer was far from comforting, because they had all lost their lives in the first wave of monsters. It was so sudden that everyone's first thought was how to save themselves, not anyone else. As far as the military is concerned, there are quite a few of them left alive. Of course, it's nothing like what we had before, but compared to the chefs, it's an impressive number. As soon as the guys moved here, they immediately reinforced the defenses around the ammunition depots, and everyone was armed to the teeth. Each of the soldiers looked as exhausted as possible. They all had different uniforms, but the only good thing is that all the survivors managed to gather in a certain place. At one point, the system offers a new notification, informing you that the primate cooking enlightenment has been received. After reading that, John literally had 5 kopeck eyes, because he couldn't understand why the system had given him such a strange skill. Maybe she's not referring to the real primates. She's referring to all these humans, but if that's true, it's a real delusion that defies any description. Suddenly some soldier comes up to the guy and asks for a report. Initially he didn't quite understand what the report was about, so he asked again. As it turned out, Lieutenant Kim is now in charge of the company, and when he got the information about John's survival, he requested a personal meeting with him. From what John had heard, he realized that Lieutenant Kim was apparently the only officer left. If that was true, the situation was dire, because he would not be able to lead alone. Before entering, the guy knocked lightly on the door, and warned of his intentions. Since John had been waiting there for a while, he was let in right away. To be honest, Lieutenant Kim was overjoyed that he had survived, but since there would be little to be happy about, he said the situation was dire. Then he politely asked the guy to sit down next to them and talk a bit about how to proceed. They decided to start with the good news. Lieutenant Kim confirmed the fact that there were still quite a few survivors, but that was no reason to scatter the personnel on the right to the left. In general, John himself was not the best opinion of this lieutenant, because he is a dirty, greedy, low-level officer who is very poorly oriented in his work. Also, for some reason, he constantly criticized the food that the guy cooked, and always tried to do it in a showy way. Also, unlike everyone else, he could calmly come to the kitchen and start ordering food as if he was in a restaurant, not a military unit. His behavior is completely inconsistent with the status. And now this man will command the entire unit. If you do not find him a worthy replacement, there could be many problems. After the good news, the lieutenant took in his hands and the lists, and began to carefully look at how many people were left in the small units. The first thing that caught his eye was the absence of all the other commanders. Even though he didn't so much as know they were gone, the tears began to come on their own. Looking at the whole situation from the outside, John began to clearly realize that about a large half of all the soldiers are not even approximately ready for what they can expect in battle against monsters, because they are simply very weak, both physically and mentally. Seeing all this horror will cease to be effective. Suddenly another soldier bursts into the room and openly declares that he is ready to replace Sergeant Travis for a while, exactly until he recovers and can perform all his duties as in times of peace. In principle, his candidacy was quickly approved, and then went on the list. After each point, the lieutenant's face became more and more tense, because he began to realize that in this situation there was nothing left but to form small units again, and to organize small courses for the soldiers who would eventually receive a new specialty. In general, according to rough estimates, there are about 100 men in the armory. Total losses are almost half of the battalion. To say that this is a lot is simply not to say anything, although at first glance, the lieutenant could not even guess that their losses are so large. Also, from the bad news, after countless attempts to contact the outside world, the guys stated the fact that they no longer have communication, and only God knows what happened downstairs with the rest of the military units and civilians, but apparently there is not much good there. After hearing the information, Lieutenant Kim repeated his favorite phrase again: the situation is maximum critical, and it is necessary to do something as soon as possible. Apparently it is the only thing he can do best. But be that as it may, he still can't get it into his head that the unit once again no longer has any communication with the outside world. After all, after the last incident, they had offered a great deal of effort to take their communication towers to a whole other level, but as it turned out, it wasn't that effective. After a few more minutes of such tense discussions, the military began to talk openly about the fact that if nothing changes in the next 24 hours, there is a 90% chance that they will stay here forever and just fight until they run out of supplies and food. All the military gradually began to feel very anxious, but as soon as there is a clear goal, the soldiers will calm down a bit, because they will focus on fulfilling it as quickly as possible. In general, to raise the morale of all soldiers, it is one of the integral tasks of the commander, but to put it mildly, he does not cope with it. As the only active duty officer, he has to make some kind of adequate decision. But when all the military saw that even he could not do it, they began to panic even more. Because in their opinion, if the lieutenant can't do it, then they can't think of anything to do. John looked at them from the sidelines, and he couldn't understand why such grown men, instead of coming to a joint decision, started to panic and tried to shift the responsibility to each other. After another short period of time, Lieutenant Kim was finally able to come up with something left to do. Since the military unit had lost the ability to communicate with the outside world, he suggested sending a couple of soldiers to contact the upper units, listen to their instructions, and bring that information back here. In principle, the idea is pretty good, but if you take into account the fact of how many monsters climb in this area, it becomes quite scary. Because the chance that the guys sent on a mission will not come back is very big. Unfortunately, people are so few, so the unit has no right to lose more. Then John breaks into the conversation and starts talking about how the other units are high up in the mountains. It's about 1,400 meters above sea level. Even if the guys went there, it would take too long to get there, and that's not even taking into account the fact that monsters might attack. It didn't take long for the boys to endorse this theory, because first of all, they certainly wouldn't want anyone to be sent away, and secondly, it's really far and extremely dangerous to go. After what had happened, deep down Lieutenant Very was very disappointed in John, and decided not to rely on his words in any way. He certainly agreed that it was dangerous, but it had to be done. So the next suggestion was to select a few volunteers and send them on their way. Frankly speaking, it was almost impossible to find volunteers for such an adventure, but the lieutenant hardly realized it. From such a rash decision, John realized that Lieutenant Kim was not going to command. After all, he was trying to avoid responsibility by saying that he had to get the order of higher-ranking persons who were in another flat part, but no matter how it was, if he made a mistake, he would still have to answer for it. Of course, the situation is not easy, but a commander should never behave like that. At least it is disrespectful to his subordinates. John really expected more from him, and didn't even think he was capable of it. Since there was no one else in the room, they went to look outside. After this small meeting, John went to the kitchen to ask the other troops how much food they had left. It was estimated that there was about 5 days of normal food left, or 6 weeks if you were to save a lot of money. Roughly speaking, given the current composition, it is safe to say that if nothing changes, the unit will last a maximum of 2 months, which is the most extreme terms that should not be allowed in any case. Then it came to ammunition. All the training shells were used up last week, so only the combat kits are left. Of course they are plentiful, but without additional supplies. Anyway, the military is dealing with monsters, which means the ammo consumption will be several times greater. After that, the lieutenant and the military began a heated discussion about how they would deal with the monsters left on the base, because sooner or later they would have to be driven out of there. Then they discussed electricity and water, and finally decided on the goal of contacting the higher-ups. Like John said, once the soldiers had a target, they calmed down a bit. Then the lieutenant asked everyone in the room to go and relay the information to the military that was left outside. Honestly, the guy couldn't believe the meeting would end like this. After all, they hadn't even discussed the most important thing yet, which was the awakening. As soon as John said it out loud, everyone looked at him rather strangely, and had no idea what he was trying to say. By the term monster hunting, the lieutenant meant exterminating them with firearms. At that moment John realized for himself that apparently he was the only damaged one here, and no one else from all these guys had gotten the special system. In that case, the guy pulled out his knife and said he had something he needed to show them right away. To be honest, everyone around him was a bit scared, and even without waiting for a demonstration of what the guy wanted to show, they immediately wondered why he needed it. To prove that recently John can cook anything he wants, he decided right in front of his colleagues to cut apart a wooden table. To say that the guys were shocked is an understatement, because John made it look as easy as if it wasn't wood, but paper. As we already know, this talent is called basic dagger skills. Then he told us that in the process of fighting monsters, he was able to awaken and learn how to do something like this. The lieutenant's surprise was unprecedented. He didn't even know how to react to it. First of all, he was shocked by the fact that John had managed to destroy the monster with just one knife, and secondly, the fact that he had awakened. It was certainly hard to believe, but John had already demonstrated his skills and confirmed his words. To be honest, the guy still doesn't understand how he managed to survive, but now he wouldn't be surprised if he lost his life in 2 seconds, for example. Nobody knows for sure when food and ammunition may run out. By the way, there were only 3 days left till demobilization, and now nobody knows how many days are left. In any case, no matter how dire the situation is, the guy is not going to simply decide this life, because he has a goal, to get out of here alive, and in the near future to open his own restaurant. For the sake of realizing his dreams, he is ready for absolutely everything, and will fight to the very end. First of all, to survive, John needs to feed all the soldiers, because absolutely none of them cannot function properly on an empty stomach. Suddenly a soldier bursts into the room and reports that the monsters are fast approaching. At the moment there are at least 5 of them, most likely only those who were spotted. As soon as the guys finished the meeting, they showed up. Without wasting a minute, the military began to scatter to their positions and enter full combat readiness. The situation is as tense as possible. Within a few minutes, the monsters had already managed to sneak into the territory. The brave warriors didn't run anywhere, and tried their best to stop the enemy by firing crazily to kill. Basically, it's working so far. The monsters are very unhappy to be greeted like this. It was as if each monster takes at least one whole magazine, but despite this, the military were forced to save ammunition, just by any means necessary. The only good thing is that at least firearms on them works. In the end, it was found out that one monster takes about 20 to 30 shots. To be frank, there is no chance that the ammunition will be enough for a few days. Of course, for the time being, the guys will be able to hold out, but without a proper supply, it could all be over too quickly. After about 30 minutes of uninterrupted fire, the cleanup was officially complete. Then the order came to unhook the perimeter well and check the walls for serious damage. Meanwhile, the senior men were busy rereading their personnel to see what kind of casualties there were. During a complete inspection of the area, it was found out that this time the attack of monsters could not survive 2 military men. Especially for such cases, the guys organized a cemetery near here. The body is packed in a bag, and then carefully placed in a hole and buried. When the situation became more or less calm again, the plans approved at the meeting slowly began to be implemented. The main task of the 2 volunteers: send a request for support to the higher unit and wait for a response. And until the mission is accomplished, it is desirable not to return. In response to this, the guys said that they know where there is a safe place to wait in case of another attack. They also added that the fuel in their cars is more than enough, so in case of emergency they can go the farthest road, for the greatest safety. John in turn thought about one very interesting thing, such as how to increase the number of awakened. He realized that if he could do that, it would be much easier to fight monsters, save ammunition, and save a lot of lives of servicemen. The military was equally puzzled by this issue. Because John was able to awaken immediately after destroying the monster, and for some reason they can't. Perhaps it's directly related to the fact that they destroy them with firearms instead of cold weapons, as was the case with the guy. It's basically the only logical explanation for why no one else is able to awaken. John also added that when he destroyed the monster in close contact, he felt his body begin to overflow with a kind of energy he had never felt before. It's possible that monsters release this energy before they lose their lives, and humans just need to be around to absorb it. Of course, this is just a theory for now, but until someone in the military comes face to face with a monster, there's no way to disprove it. In this case, the guys began to work out a step-by-step plan, how to defeat their opponent in close contact, because at first glance this whole idea seems far from the best. For example, with the help of weapons, you can bring the monster in a very difficult state, and then take a knife in his hands and try to finish him manual. The main thing is that the one who dares to come very close, in no way confused, and be sure to hit his weak spot. Because in case of failure to do so, then most likely will not be able to save themselves. In such a case, the lieutenant suggested that special knives with a very long blade should be made. The rest of the military supported him, because using a special knife would be much safer than trying to hit the target with a regular knife. Now that's a methodical approach. This guy who went first is pretty weak in real combat, but at least he's strategic. In this case, it was decided to leave the question of knife making to him, and the rest of the guys would go to the so-called canteen and eat a little. Because at a time like this, you need to eat well to be full of energy, and not be distracted by an empty stomach. Well, after lunch was over, John said he had to go to the kitchen and start cooking supper. He had asked the captain's permission to do so. Of course he agreed, for if the men were to fight, they must be well fed, and he also provided 2 more soldiers to help him. In that case, sometime around 7 p.m., John would start running people into the mess hall in small groups, and would rotate them at 20-minute intervals. He also asked the commander to give as many people as possible the information about the awakening. In the meantime, the 2 brave guys were already at full throttle heading towards the unit, which was located high in the mountains. John was cooking in the kitchen, and couldn't understand why the whole cooking process felt like a vacation, not a job. Is this how the effect of the initial cooking talent works? Initially he couldn't even imagine how he could cook it all by himself, but in the end there was absolutely no problem at all. Tonight, the military will have deep-fried pork brisket for dinner. Not even every restaurant has that. Immediately after successfully cooking the dish, the system sent a new notification informing that the chef's sensitivity had increased, and with it the culinary characteristics. It also informed that eating this dish would increase the dexterity system for a certain period of time. A little later, John discovered a new skill called Chef's Special Sauce. The essence of this sauce is that the guy will be able to change the emotions of those who ate his dish. To say that he was surprised is just nothing to say, because in his hands some really strange energy. How is it to change the emotions of others? At the moment, everyone was panicking and shaking with fear, so he hoped that he could help them to feel a little calmer. So without thinking long, John pulled himself together and added the chef's special sauce with a calming effect to his dish. Now the main thing is to start eating and see how the military behaves. As soon as the guy opened the doors to the mess hall, there was a line immediately. In principle, as always, the servicemen filled their plates full of food, because they realized that the next meal would be strictly on schedule. Looking at them from the sidelines, John began to notice a genuine smile on their faces that he hadn't seen in a long time. And the military was shocked to say the least when they realized that John had prepared all of these masterpieces by himself. Of course, this sauce will not make the muscles grow faster, nor will it give 6 cubes, but nevertheless at the moment the good mood of the guys is much more important. To make sure of it, the guy decided to go out into the hall and watch. As soon as John opened the door, the men immediately began to thank him for such a delicious meal, because not all of them had wives who could cook so well. As they say, compliments. It's always nice, and it adds motivation. From that moment, John was sure that the sauce worked more than perfectly, and was very happy about it. So far, the guy was not sure about the characteristics, but definitely this skill could be good for controlling their knowledge, of course in a positive way, not to give them the opportunity to go into themselves. And frankly, it made John very angry, because he wanted the guys to get some rest. But apparently not this time. Just 2 minutes later, the military were armed to the teeth and ready to take the fight to the ground. In a moment the gunshots stopped. Let's hope that the guys are alright, and this night will be without funerals. When the guys finally arrived at the place, John immediately asked what was going on here, and why there were so many shots. For some reason no one could answer him properly for a long time. It lasted exactly until the guy met his close acquaintance. He explained to him that he had accidentally noticed the monster, so without thinking long, the guys who were within a radius of 10 meters decided to chase after him, because they were just crazy to wake up. As a result, they managed to bring 2 monsters to a very serious condition, but they remained alive, which allows anyone who wants to try to finish them with a cold weapon, and thus awaken. Now it's just a matter of deciding who's going to do it. The first candidate appeared almost immediately. He was very determined, and he was certainly not going to give up his seat. But even so, John said the following, which he thought would be a good idea if those present at the meeting were awakened first. Because it will be quite difficult to explain to everyone else that it is necessary to come almost right up to the monster for the sake of some awakening. The first thing you need to show that it is not so dangerous, and there is nothing to fear here in principle. In the end they did so. After everything was done exactly as instructed, a new awakened one appeared. The soldier was shocked, to say the least, because he didn't believe it was real until the last moment. But when he saw it with his own eyes, he just started screaming with joy. Everyone around him was as surprised as possible, and John was the only one who stood there with a smile on his face, because he realized that at this moment his colleague was facing a system window. By the way, the name of this guy who just awakened is Jacob. At this point in his body, things are happening just like they were for John. He's starting to feel the energy side of him, which is slowly starting to overflow. Well, you could say that victory. Now the unit has clear proof that the awakening is true. Jacob said he was an aspiring mage with a predisposition to electricity, and the skill was called Thunderstorm, but it was hard to tell if the position was related to real talent or not. But in any case, it is now clear that everyone can awaken, if he can defeat the monster in close combat. Until now, Almost no one believed that this is true, but now that he saw with his own eyes, could not say anything against it. Well, now it's time for the second man to awaken. By the way, the name of this young fighter is Mason, and if we speak frankly, you can see how much he is nervous. He was scared even from the realization of the fact that he is standing next to a living monster. Yes, of course, he is practically deprived of life, but nevertheless easier from this Mason did not become. Before he did his job, the guy persuaded the monster to lie still and not move. Whether they finally managed to come to an agreement is still unclear. To be sure to hit the weakest point, Mason literally stood on the monster with both feet, and prepared to deliver the final blow. As a result, Mason lost his balance and fell to the ground, after which the monster, without wasting a moment, opened its huge mouth and bit the guy right on the leg. To be frank, the situation is as critical as it gets. It's hard to imagine the best course of action. Because of the intense pain, Mason began to scream as loudly as he had never screamed before in his life. The other soldiers were about to start shooting, but John stopped them, because he was sure that the guy could do it alone. Then he turned to him, and told him not to lie on the floor idly, but to try to take the machine gun, and finally finish what he had started. Through great fear and pain, Mason nevertheless agreed, grabbed the machine gun with his last strength, and still managed to strike a decisive blow to the weak point of the enemy. Then he finally lost consciousness, and Mason was able to awaken. Then it was urgently decided to call a medic, but unfortunately he was a rather weak specialist, and could hardly help, but at any rate it was better than nothing. At least the wound should be treated. According to Mason, as for the bitten monster, the bite was quite severe. At one point he even thought he would never be able to see his leg again, but as it turned out, everything turned out okay. Unfortunately, there is still a long road of treatment and further rehabilitation ahead. Thus the unrest among the soldiers stopped. 2 young promising guys were able to awaken. From this we can say that an army that will be able to fight monsters without bullets began to form. But even with such positive results, there were still those who did not want to awaken. The most important thing was that there were clearly fewer of them than those who wanted to wake up. At one point Jacob decided to take matters into his own hands, and tried to convince the officers that there was nothing wrong with waking up, and to remind them that this was likely the only way to survive the horror. But despite all attempts to change his mind, the officer did not agree to the process of awakening, arguing that there is no guarantee that he will not lose his life during it. He also added that Mason got off easy, although in fact he will lose his life because of some awakening. By the way, this man is a specialist from the equipment division, and in his business he is considered a real master. But honestly it's hard to understand why he is so much scared, unlike all the others. Categorically refuses to become stronger, and cannot even calmly look at the bodies of monsters. John didn't like this behavior, to say the least, because of this alarmist, every day there may be more people willing to give up waking up. Which is something we can't let happen. In the end, the boys did stay away from him, but preliminarily informed that he would never be a senior again. Being a leader is a very important role, and right now the unit needs an awakened leader. But since the man has refused to do so, he has to accept the fact that he has lost all his powers, and will soon take the place of a regular soldier. Jacob is certainly right about something, because there's no way this guy can be a frontline commander after what he did. He was known for his qualities, but given his current mood, there's no way you can act on that man's instructions, because it's not going to lead to anything good. When John realized that the situation was starting to stink, he asked Jacob to talk to him one-on-one about the whole situation, and told the man that he could go back to his position. At first Jacob didn't even want to go into the conversation, but the guy grabbed his arm and dragged him along. John tried to convey to him that for the sake of the mood of the entire unit, he should not, under any circumstances, create and stop insisting that people go to awaken. Jacob understood this perfectly well, but what could he do if a colleague showed absolutely no desire to force? It was wrong to force it. After this conversation, surely a decent number of guys are thinking about desertion, not about continuing to defend their military unit, and further awakening, and against the background of the fact that, This whole situation with monsters has been going on for a long time. Some of the guys are on the verge of a nervous breakdown. They are unpredictable people in general. The only good thing about this whole situation is that no one's escaped yet, but it's a fact that people want to leave, because they all have families. So if the guys want to survive, they have to raise morale in their unit, and make it a lot stronger by waking up. Only then will the military stop thinking about avoidance, and finally start to feel safe. Jacob agrees, but there's a problem. It's not just one man who's afraid of waking up, it's a lot of other people who are also afraid of waking up. Most of them are young military men who keep saying that they can't risk their lives so much for the sake of awakening. Even if we allow the situation that some part of people slowly started to awaken, it might eventually cause a conflict between the regular military and the awakened ones. In general, the situation is as dire as possible, and it is very difficult to find the right solution, because this kind of disagreement will eventually lead to strong quarrels, and weaken the unit from within, which will eventually lead to its complete ineffectiveness during the battle, which means heavy casualties, desertions, and so on. In the end, John made a brilliant deduction: for awakening, rejection is unacceptable. In simple terms, he wants to force absolutely all the troops to awaken, even though half of them really don't want to do it. The most important thing is to initially convince the man who refused to wake up in front of everyone. John has an idea of how to do that, but he needs a little time to realize it. It won't be easy, but at least it's worth a try. John knew in his heart that if he had any other job, he'd be long gone by now. But as it is, he's an aspiring level 1 chef. He's a good backup who can't fend for himself, so to get things back on track, he needs to start cooking even better. John doesn't want this unit to be hopeless, so he will do his best to make it at least a few times stronger. Thanks to the fact that he is awakened and has access to a unique system, it's more than possible to do so, but the main thing is not to give up. This time it was decided not to make a lot of wisecracks, and just cook everyone's favorite fried rice, but make it as tasty as the guy has never done before. During cooking, the system notified the guy that the quality of the main ingredient meat leaves much to be desired. But the quality of the auxiliary ingredient of the seasoning is excellent. Thanks to it, the characteristics of the dish will be slightly increased. In general, in simple words, this dish may not be liked by everyone, but if a person does eat it, all its effects will be increased. And of course John didn't forget to add his signature ingredient, a special sauce, only this time it can be used to change the emotions of every person who eats this meal. Let's hope the sauce works as well as it should, and the guy can get some use out of this dinner. When everything was ready, John went over to a serviceman and asked him to invite Jack to come to the mess hall. After a while, the man finally arrived, and was surprised to say the least when he saw that John had prepared a huge plate of chicken fried rice for him. The guy argued that Jack never eats anything, so he decided to cook something for him separately. He also knows that the man is always hungry, so he will definitely not take no for an answer. In this case, Jack said that he would eat everything and even thanked him for it. Especially for this occasion, the guy tried to cook the best that he could, so just madly hope that all his future plans will slowly begin to materialize, start already from today. When Jack once again said that the dish is very tasty, John said that if he wants to give more can give more. But as soon as the man had enough to eat, John would find something to talk to him about. When the rice was done, Jack started apologizing for all his actions and his public refusal to wake up. It's actually because he's been like this since he was a kid, always being told to man up. It was also said that physical training gave him confidence. Amidst this constant moral crush, Jack himself unwillingly began to exercise and martial arts, but unfortunately it did not help him to become more confident. Now it became clear why he is so pumped up, and constantly tries to maintain his shape, even at a time when it is completely inappropriate. For sure it was hard for him to live a weak character. The man spent his whole life trying to do more to avoid being a burden to other people. At one point he even thought he was lucky, people finally recognized him, but he couldn't imagine what would end up happening, an invasion of some rabid monsters, right while he's serving in the army. also told his one secret, that he actually secretly admires John for all his heroic deeds. Like how he fought the monster even after seeing the taking of a comrade's life, not everyone can pull themselves together and act normally after such a sight. In response, he said he was no less scared than the rest of us. But if you sit back and do nothing, eventually all the people in that military unit will become monster dinner, which is something you don't want to happen. In John's case, the loss of his comrades' lives brought him to his senses, and instead of withdrawing into himself, he began to do as much as he could to save himself. In addition, the guy himself is very young, roughly speaking, he just started his life, and in no way can afford to lose his life like this, being in the military unit. After all, he has dreams, for example, to celebrate his demob, in the future to open a restaurant, and make a lot of money at his favorite business. Of course, to be like that, it took a lot of courage, making the right decisions, creating an environment of like-minded people, and so on. And now the guy's main goal is to survive, along with all the people who are here, because they want it too. When Jack heard this heartwarming story, he stood up abruptly from the table and said he wanted to try it too, to be as brave as he was. To be honest, John was a little shocked at the result. He couldn't tell if it was the food, or if the man had really just been so inspired by the story. He also said, with great anger, that the next monster would be his, and urged him not to deprive him of this opportunity to awaken as soon as possible, and to become as useful to his unit as possible. When it came, Jack didn't even pick up a knife, he fought his opponent with his bare hands. And in the process, he begged his colleagues not to help him in any way, because this is the moment when Jack will test his personal courage. All the soldiers were shocked to say the least. The monster had not even had time to lose consciousness, and Jack had already attacked him with his bare hands. Jacob walked over to the boy and wondered what it was all about. How could a man who didn't want to wake up at all be so angry and eager to do so? If something went wrong, Jack could be badly injured, or in extreme cases, lose his life. In the course of the fight, the boys began to notice that Jack is actually several times stronger than this terrible monster. He easily blocks his blows, and even manages to make his own. To put it mildly, the man is unrecognizable. Was he always like this deep down inside? At one point the audience began to admire Jack so much that they began to applaud him and try to support him in every possible way. Even Jacob expressed his respect to John for such quality work, but unfortunately their joy did not last long. The thing is that Jack became so mad that he literally began to bite his rival. And he did it so hard, that as a rule, until he takes something with him, he will not get off. To say that everyone was shocked by this behavior is just not to say anything. How a man who just yesterday had been so terrified was capable of such terrible things. John was frankly nervous. He realized he'd probably added too much sauce, but he didn't think his plan would work so emphatically. Even after the monster has finally started in life, Jack decided not to stop there, and took a stone in his hands, and continued to strike countless blows. For what purpose he does this is difficult to determine, but one thing is certain: as long as he does not fulfill his plan, no one will be able to stop him for sure. After a few more minutes of such active beating, the system window finally appeared in front of his eyes. Then he finally stopped, threw the stone on the ground, and slowly began to move away from the body of his opponent. For some reason during this he began to laugh very loudly, and boast that he had awakened. Despite the fact that Jack used some unconventional methods of fighting, no one condemned him for this, and even on the contrary, the guys were very happy when he was able to awaken, and immediately ran to meet him to congratulate him. After all, from this moment in this territory has already awakened. When the man turned to face the audience, the guys noticed that he looked quite scary, so they decided to stop and hug some other time. Then Jack said that's how brave he became only thanks to one person, namely John, and was insanely grateful for it. Of course, the other soldiers immediately asked John what he had done to him, and he said nothing, and next time he would be more careful with the dosage, because what he had today was clearly too much. By the way, from that moment on, Jack began to enjoy popularity among his friends again. To be honest, he was like a different person. Jacob was always asking the same question because he was so curious about what John had done to him. He said it was nothing special, just a delicious dinner and a little conversation with him. I wonder when John became so eloquent. I wonder since when John has been so eloquent, especially for people who need it so badly. Anyway, the power of moral support should not be underestimated. It is very important, especially for those people who need it very much. There's certainly some truth to those words, but Jacob is almost 100% sure that John's not telling the truth anyway. And he's right, because it doesn't seem like the truth, no matter how much the guy wants to tell, but for now he can say openly that it's all due to skill. Now, after what we've seen today, you can't exactly call Jack a harmless person, because he's not, but it's safe to say that this change of character is only temporary. It's scary to imagine what would have happened if the guy had added more sauce. The most important thing here is not to overdo it. From that moment things started to go uphill. More and more people started to wake up, but this time the guys decided to approach this issue more responsibly and of course to feed well beforehand, but not as well as Jack, otherwise it could end badly. Then we talked about the food. John said that the expiration dates are starting to come to an end. It is necessary to eat everything that is left as soon as possible, otherwise it will just have to throw it in the trash, which I would not like to do, and then we will have to think about where to get new food, because there will be nothing left except for the reserve supply. Emergency stock is canned food that can be kept practically faithful, but if eaten, the unit will be left completely without food, which should never be allowed. By the way, emergency ones do not require special cooking. It is necessary to check how the system will react to them. After a while, the unit was again attacked by monsters, but since the guys had already fully built their lines of defense, holding them back was not such a difficult task. In general, not without exceptions in the form of small losses, you could say the awakening went quite smoothly. There were also times when the military didn't calculate a little bit of strength, and instead of leaving the monster in a heavy state, destroyed it completely. Of course, Jacob didn't like such a blunder at all and yelled at everyone at once, because each missed monster prolongs the process of awakening. So based on that, we can say that the process wasn't exactly smooth after all. The biggest problem is that getting the monster close enough for someone to deliver the final blow wasn't so easy, because they're too resilient on their own. Most of the monsters try to attack as hard as they can until they are completely devoid of life. It was as if they began to understand. In this place, with the help of them, people began to awaken en masse. The main criterion of awakenings is that they should be safe. It was not easy to do this. Finally, after a period of time, the guys again managed to catch another monster. Now it is necessary to decide who will be next. After a few minutes of deliberation, John chose a young boy from the transportation consumption, wished him luck and sent him to finish what he had started. He looked pretty confident, but no matter how you looked at it, there was a lot of nervousness inside. A couple of minutes to prepare, one precise blow, and that was it. This guy probably did better and faster than the others. When the system window opened, some strange new message appeared there. Since initially the guy didn't understand what it meant, he was very frightened and started screaming loudly. Meanwhile, the process of faction formation started in the system. It started automatically after the 5 awakened appeared. But so far even John doesn't know how this faction will affect them in the future. As soon as the new kid awakened, all 5 people had the same notification pop up on the screen. It said that the guys had unlocked a new achievement called General Gathering, and that they had succeeded in faction consciousness faster than the other awakened ones. For this, participants will be given a special reward in the form of 10 growth elixir jars. From now on, for a limited time, the guys will receive 500% more experience than usual for all their merits. Against this backdrop, an urgent meeting was organized to find out how to proceed.